The year was 1920. The Great War had ended, and the world was tired. Across the Atlantic Ocean in the United States, people were ready for something different. They were ready for life to feel lighter, easier, brighter. The decade that followed would come to be called the Roaring Twenties. But in truth, it did not roar for everyone. It hummed, it whispered, it drifted along in a rhythm that seemed new. Cities began to glow with electric lights. At night, lamps flickered in shop windows, and the hum of radios filled quiet living rooms. Families gathered close together to listen to soft voices carried through the air. Voices that felt like magic, traveling unseen across the nation. In the cities, men walked in bowler hats, their polished shoes tapping quietly on pavement. In small towns, farmers leaned on wooden fences, watching fields of wheat sway gently in the breeze. The United States felt full of promise. The country had grown wealthy from war production, and now people dreamed of a new kind of prosperity. The 1920s were an age of change. Automobiles appeared in greater numbers. Henry Ford's Model T, simple, sturdy, affordable, rolled down dusty roads in both cities and villages. Families who once traveled slowly by horse and carriage now climbed into noisy machines that rattled and shook, but carried them farther than ever before. In the evenings, jazz music floated through the air, a trumpet's soft echo, a saxophone's drifting melody. In smoky clubs, young people danced the Charleston, their steps quick, but their laughter gentle. The music was restless, but for the listener drifting to sleep, it becomes a steady rhythm, like a soft lullaby carried on warm night air. Flappers appeared, young women in short dresses, their hair cut neatly into bobs, their movements light and untroubled. They represented a freedom that felt new, though not everyone approved. In sleepy small towns, neighbors whispered, but in big cities, the new fashions glowed under street lamps. Everywhere, the mood was one of optimism. People believed in progress. They believed in growth. They believed in the future. Across Wall Street, in New York City, the stock exchange buzzed quietly each day. Long rooms filled with ticker machines, machines that tapped and clicked and tapped again, printing endless strips of paper with numbers and names. Men leaned over desks, cigarette smoke curling slowly in the air above them. Eyes followed the numbers, their minds filled with thoughts of gain, of profit, of dreams for tomorrow. But outside those rooms, ordinary people lived ordinary lives. A teacher returning home after class, her small apartment filled with the scent of tea, a family sitting around a wooden table, passing bread and stew in silence, a clerk folding his jacket neatly at the end of a long day, sitting by the window to read the evening paper. It was a nation of quiet routines, and yet, underneath, a great transformation was slowly beginning. The streets of New York City were never truly silent. Horns honked, streetcars rumbled, but if you listened carefully, you could still hear the slow footsteps of a watchman making his rounds, the faint call of a paper boy selling the day's edition, and the sigh of wind between tall buildings. Far from the cities, in the countryside, life was gentler still. Farmhouses stood at the end of dirt roads, lamplight glowing faintly from the kitchen window. The smell of bread, the sound of a radio playing faintly, children doing homework at the table while their father mended tools by the fire. The decade felt hopeful. Each day seemed to bring something new, a faster car, a brighter light bulb, a better radio, and always, the sense that tomorrow would be better than today. In the quiet hours of night, if you had walked along Wall Street, you would have seen tall stone buildings standing like silent guardians. The stock exchange itself, columns rising toward the sky, windows dark, but inside, machines waiting for the morning. Those machines, the ticker tapes, were the heartbeat of the era. Click, click, click. Each sound was a share bought, a share sold, an investor waiting for fortune or fearing loss. For now, the numbers mostly climbed higher, and with each rise, confidence grew. Investors told themselves that this new wealth would never end, that stocks only went up, that the future would always be brighter. And so, day after day, the mood remained cheerful. A man might walk home humming a tune. His wife might place a pie on the windowsill to cool. Children might play in the street until the lamps flickered on. Simple scenes, ordinary moments, all part of the gentle rhythm of the 1920s. But beneath the calm, small cracks had already begun to form. Factories produced more than people could buy. Farmers harvested more wheat than markets could sell. Banks lent more money than they could afford. And still, the optimism grew. Men and women bought stocks not with savings, but with borrowed dollars, paying only a fraction of the price, and promising to pay the rest later. It was called buying on margin, and it spread like a quiet habit across the nation. No one noticed the risk, or rather, no one wanted to notice. The newspapers printed cheerful headlines, and readers sipped their coffee with a sense of ease, believing the future was golden. For now, life went on peacefully, the air filled with jazz, the streets filled with cars, and in the windows of Wall Street, tickers clicked endlessly through the night. The roaring 20s had begun, and the nation drifted gently into its dream of endless prosperity. The 1920s were often called an age of prosperity, a time when America seemed to stand taller, brighter, wealthier than ever before. It was a decade painted in glowing colors, a time when people believed that almost anything was possible. For the listener, it unfolds not as a roar, but as a gentle rhythm, the steady heartbeat of daily life slowly changing with each passing year. In towns large and small, prosperity was visible everywhere. It was in the hum of factories that produced endless goods, radios, automobiles, refrigerators, telephones. It was in the shop windows, where new fashions gleamed under electric light. It was in the music that drifted from dance halls, cafes, and theaters. Soft melodies of jazz and blues wrapping themselves around evening air. Families that had once lived with little now found themselves able to buy more. For the first time, many households had radios, simple wooden boxes with glowing dials that connected them to the outside world. Voices traveled invisibly across the airwaves, carrying news, sermons, stories, and music. A father might lean closer to hear the announcer's words. A child might sit cross-legged on the floor, wide-eyed at the sound of faraway places. And as the radio hummed, the house seemed warmer, brighter, more alive. Credit had changed everything. In earlier years, families saved patiently for what they needed. They placed coins carefully in jars or envelopes, counting slowly until they could afford a new chair, or a sewing machine, or a stove. But now, merchants and banks offered something new: installment plans. Families could bring home what they wanted right away, and pay for it little by little, month by month. The habit spread quietly. Radios, cars, furniture, clothing, even small luxuries, all purchased with promises of future payment. For many, this new way of living felt like freedom. They could enjoy things now, instead of waiting. The store clerk smiled as he wrapped the package. The customer left with a sense of pride. And at home, the item was placed carefully, as though it symbolized not only comfort, but progress. Cities reflected this prosperity most clearly. Skyscrapers rose higher, their steel frames gleaming in sunlight. Elevators carried workers swiftly to upper floors. Down below, streets filled with automobiles, trolleys, bicycles, and pedestrians. Department stores displayed endless rows of hats, coats, gloves, and shoes. Women walked arm in arm beneath tall windows, glancing at the newest fashions with quiet delight. Men carried folded newspapers, eyes drawn to the market reports printed inside. New York City, especially, became the heart of it all. Broadway lights flickered in neon colors. Jazz spilled from hidden clubs in Harlem, and downtown, near Wall Street, the rhythm of money seemed to echo through every stone. Yet, prosperity was not only in the cities. In small towns, main streets grew busier. General stores carried more goods than ever before. Post offices, banks, barber shops, and movie theaters lined the same dusty road. Children ran to buy penny candy. Families gathered to see silent films in the evenings. The whir of a projector filling the darkened room. Laughter or gasps rising from the crowd as images flickered across the screen. On farms, too, change was visible. Tractors replaced horses in many fields. Barns filled with newer tools. Some farmers built larger homes with screened porches and electric lights. But prosperity in the countryside was uneven. For many farmers, the cost of modern equipment rose faster than the price of crops. Wheat and corn fetched lower prices than before. Fields grew heavy with grain, yet profits grew smaller. But for now, the overall mood remained hopeful. In middle-class neighborhoods, families felt the glow of rising wealth. Houses stood in tidy rows, porches decorated with chairs and hanging plants. Children played jump rope in the street, their laughter drifting into the warm dusk. Inside, mothers prepared dinners of roast chicken or stew. Fathers returned from offices or shops, folding their coats neatly before sitting down at the table. And when dinner ended, the family might gather in the parlor to read aloud, or to listen to the radio, or simply to talk about the day. Sunday evenings carried a special calm. Church bells echoed softly. Families strolled through parks, admiring fountains and gardens. Couples sat quietly on benches, watching the sun dip below rooftops. In these moments, prosperity did not mean riches alone. It meant peace, security, a sense of belonging to a world that seemed steady and good. Advertising grew alongside prosperity. Bright posters and billboards promised happiness through products. Soap that would bring beauty, cars that would bring freedom, radios that would bring togetherness. Each advertisement painted a picture not only of a product, but of a dream. And as people passed these signs, they began to believe that happiness could be purchased, one installment payment at a time. Magazines filled with glossy pages of smiling faces. Women in satin gowns pouring coffee from shiny percolators. Men in tailored suits leaning against polished automobiles. Children laughing around toys that promised endless delight. These images whispered softly into the minds of readers. You too can have this life. You too can belong to this world of comfort and joy. Schools reflected the mood of the times. Children sat at wooden desks, pencils scratching softly on paper. Teachers spoke of progress, of invention, of new opportunities. Maps hung on classroom walls, showing oceans and nations far away. And in every lesson, there was the quiet suggestion that the future would hold even more. More knowledge, more growth, more prosperity. At night, cities glowed like never before. Street lamps lit sidewalks where couples strolled arm in arm. Cafes spilled golden light into the darkness, their windows misted with warmth. Inside, the sound of glasses clinking and voices murmuring filled the air. A violin played softly in the corner. Outside, a taxi horn echoed briefly before fading into the hum of the night. In these years, prosperity also meant leisure. Baseball stadiums filled with cheering crowds, parks filled with picnics. Amusement parks offered rides that spun and lifted people into the air. Beaches filled with swimmers and families in striped bathing costumes. The world felt lighter, easier, as though hard times had been left behind forever. On Wall Street, prosperity was measured not in laughter, but in numbers. The ticker tape machines clicked steadily, printing a never-ending stream of trades. Each click represented a buyer and a seller, a belief in the future. Investors crowded into broker offices, watching the tape spool across counters. Sometimes they cheered when prices rose. Sometimes they sighed when prices dipped. But mostly they believed in the steady climb upward. Stock prices rose higher and higher, and with them, confidence spread. Newspapers carried stories of people who had grown wealthy almost overnight. A clerk who invested in the right company. A teacher who bought a few shares and saw them double. Tales like these encouraged more to follow. More people opened accounts. More families borrowed money to join the market. The dream of prosperity reached further than ever before. But for the sleepy listener, the story is not one of excitement. It is one of repetition, of routine, of steady footsteps across polished floors, of quiet pages turned in evening newspapers, of radios humming softly in darkened rooms. In farmhouses, families listened to the sound of crickets outside their windows. In city apartments, the distant hum of traffic drifted upward. In small towns, dogs barked faintly at the passing of strangers. Each sound was part of the larger lullaby of the nation, a song of prosperity that filled the 1920s. Prosperity was not equal. While many celebrated abundance, others lived with less. In crowded neighborhoods, families shared small apartments. Children slept 2 or 3 to a bed. Fathers worked long shifts for modest wages. Yet even here, the glow of the decade was felt. A borrowed radio, a shared newspaper, a single pair of fashionable shoes polished carefully to last. Hope extended even to those who had little. for the mood of the nation was strong enough to carry them too. For immigrants, prosperity meant possibility. Men and women who had crossed oceans in search of a better life found jobs in factories, on docks, in shops. They sent money back to families overseas. They wrote letters filled with words of progress. They saved what they could, believing that their children would one day live easier, wealthier lives. The streets they walked were not always golden, but they carried the quiet shine of opportunity. The decade was also marked by new inventions. Silent film turned to sound. Talkies filled theaters with voices for the first time. Audiences sat in wonder as actors spoke on screen. Planes flew farther, faster, carrying mail and adventurous passengers across states and oceans. Telephones connected voices from city to city. New medicines appeared in pharmacies, and each invention seemed to promise that the world would only grow more wondrous. In parlors and dining rooms, families spoke of progress. A father might say that one day everyone would own an automobile. A mother might dream aloud of a washing machine that saved hours of labor. Children might imagine flying across the sky or hearing music carried to them from faraway countries. Dreams became part of ordinary conversation, woven into the fabric of daily life. As the decade unfolded, prosperity seemed endless. Each year brought higher profits, larger buildings, newer machines. The rhythm of growth never seemed to pause. The stock market climbed, wages grew, stores filled. Newspapers printed headlines of success. And in homes across the nation, people felt secure in the belief that tomorrow would always be brighter than today. The nation lived inside a gentle dream, a dream of abundance, of comfort, of progress without end. Families rested in that dream each night, radios humming, lamps glowing, cars parked neatly by the curb, children asleep in warm beds, parents whispering softly before drifting into slumber. The dream was steady, calm, reassuring. And so, the 1920s continued, each day filled with small joys, each night filled with quiet hopes, a nation wrapped in the comfort of prosperity, drifting gently through time, unaware of the storm that waited beyond the horizon. In the heart of New York City, there stood a street unlike any other, a narrow stretch of stone and asphalt, lined with tall buildings of marble and steel, a street where the rhythm of footsteps mixed with the rhythm of money. This was Wall Street, and in the 1920s, it rose to become the very symbol of prosperity. The stock exchange building itself stood like a temple, with tall columns reaching toward the sky, carved stone holding the weight of dreams. By day, its doors opened to a stream of men in suits and hats, briefcases in hand, papers folded under arms, their shoes tapped firmly against the pavement, the sound blending with carriage wheels and the honk of motor cars. By night, the building rested in silence, shadows stretching across its grand facade. But even then, the spirit of commerce never truly slept. Inside, the exchange buzzed with quiet intensity. Large rooms filled with rows of desks and wires. Ticker machines lined the walls, clicking and tapping, printing endless strips of paper. Each strip carried the story of a trade, a name, a number, a price. The sound was constant, steady, like the heartbeat of the decade. Men gathered around the machines, their eyes fixed on the spooling paper. Some smoked cigars, the air thick with curling smoke. Some whispered to one another, voices low but urgent. Some simply stared, watching as prices moved upward and upward and upward still. To them, the clicking tape was like music. Each rise in price brought a faint smile. Each surge brought a breath of relief. Brokers' offices extended this rhythm beyond the exchange itself. All across New York and in towns across the nation, small offices echoed with the same sound. A clerk fed paper into a machine. Numbers poured out, black ink on thin white ribbon. Customers leaned over counters to see how their shares had fared that day. Some came in daily, some even hourly, hungry for news of their fortunes. The market had once been a place for the wealthy alone, for banks, corporations, and seasoned investors. But by the 1920s, it began to spread beyond that circle. More and more ordinary people stepped quietly into this world. Teachers saved a little and bought shares. Shopkeepers invested in small amounts. Farmers sold a harvest and placed a portion in the market. The idea that anyone, anywhere, could grow rich through stocks became a whisper that traveled far. Magazines carried stories of sudden wealth. A man who invested in a new company and saw his fortune double in a month. A woman who placed her savings on a promising firm and suddenly found herself able to buy a home. These tales passed from neighbor to neighbor, from one dinner table to another, until even those with the smallest savings felt tempted to join. The brokers welcomed them, for each new account meant more trades, and more trades meant more commissions. They smiled as they explained the process. They leaned closer as they spoke of easy gains. They reassured customers that the market had always risen, and that it would continue to rise. The office became not just a place of business, but a place of hope. Outside, Wall Street itself carried an atmosphere of importance. Messengers darted back and forth with papers. Policemen kept steady watch over the crowds. Reporters waited near steps for any scrap of news. The street felt alive, as though the pulse of the entire nation flowed through it. Banks, too, tied themselves to the market. Loans were offered easily, credit extended freely. A man could borrow money, buy shares, and pay back the loan with the profits. Or so it seemed. The practice of buying on margin grew larger each year, allowing small investors to buy far more than they could afford. The risk was quiet, hidden beneath the surface. For now, it was ignored. The newspapers printed numbers in bold letters. Stock averages rose week by week. Headlines spoke of endless growth, of a market that could not be stopped. Readers sipped morning coffee and nodded in satisfaction. Their faith deepened. Their optimism grew. On the exchange floor, the energy was constant yet calm. Men gestured with hands, voices overlapping, papers exchanged, but always beneath it, the steady sound of the ticker tape. Click, click, click. The machines never tired. They marked the passing of hours not with chimes but with numbers, lines of ink that shaped dreams of wealth. For those far from New York, the market still held a presence. In small towns, brokers' windows displayed stock prices written in chalk. Farmers paused in their way to the feed store to glance at the numbers. Clerks stopped to compare the figures before continuing home, and even in rural kitchens, the names of companies became as familiar as neighbors' names. General Electric, U.S. Steel, Radio Corporation of America. The spread of radio itself helped fuel the rise. People listened to broadcasts about companies and industries. They heard of new inventions, new discoveries, new opportunities. And with each word, the belief in endless growth deepened. A farmer might finish listening to a broadcast about aviation and imagine his small savings soaring into the sky with the planes. A clerk might hear about new electrical appliances and picture his shares glowing with profit like the bulbs in a lamp. Prosperity became tied not only to wages and goods, but to the numbers on the exchange. Each upward movement of the market seemed to lift the nation's spirits higher, and with each rise, more people stepped forward to join. Yet, even amid the cheer, there were those who watched with caution. A banker here, a professor there. They warned that the market was rising too fast, that prices were detached from reality. Their voices were soft, often ignored, drowned out by the louder chorus of optimism. For who wished to hear of danger when fortune seemed so near? In the evenings, when the exchange closed and the street grew quieter, the sense of importance did not fade. Men carried their papers home, scanning them by lamplight. Families spoke softly about stocks over dinner. Friends met in cafes and compared notes about which companies might rise next. Even in moments of rest, the presence of Wall Street lingered. The decade had given the market a special place in daily life. It was not only a financial institution, it was a dream machine. It promised not only wealth, but transformation. A man could enter as an ordinary clerk and leave, in imagination, as a gentleman of fortune. A woman could place her savings into a few shares and dream of new clothes, a new home, a better life. The exchange became a symbol of possibility. For the sleepy listener, the picture is not one of noise or frenzy, but of repetition, of soft footsteps up and down marble staircases, of the steady clicking of machines in dimly lit rooms, of the rustle of newspapers turned slowly, page by page. It is a lullaby of numbers, rising, falling, rising again, carrying with it the hopes of a nation drifting in prosperity's dream. Day after day, week after week, the ritual repeated. The exchange opened with a bell. The crowd moved in. The machines clicked to life. Orders were placed, trades recorded, paper spooled endlessly across polished counters. Outside, messengers hurried with envelopes. Policemen watched the doors. The rhythm did not break. It carried on like the turning of a wheel, steady, reliable, hypnotic. As the 1920s moved forward, Wall Street's presence grew ever larger. It was spoken of in newspapers, in cafes, in homes. Its symbols, columns, tickers, charts, became part of the nation's imagination. To many, it seemed unshakable, eternal, as though the flow of money would continue forever. And so, Wall Street rose, higher and higher, not only in numbers, but in meaning. It became the silent beacon of prosperity, the soft pulse of the roaring 20s, the place where dreams were recorded on thin paper strips, drifting endlessly from machines that never tired. Night would fall on the city. Lights would flicker in windows. Taxis would roll slowly across damp streets. And within tall stone walls, the machines rested briefly, waiting for dawn. Outside, a watchman might pause at the steps, adjusting his cap before continuing down the quiet street. The air cool, the sky heavy with stars. the exchange silent, but the dream of prosperity still alive in the hearts of millions. Wall Street, in its rise, was not only a street of stone, it was a dream that wrapped itself around an entire nation, carrying it softly, gently, into the deeper night of the decade. By the middle of the 1920s, the stock market was no longer the secret world of bankers and financiers alone. It had begun to spread outward, slowly, softly, until it reached into the homes and lives of ordinary Americans. Men and women who had once thought of stocks as distant, mysterious things now found themselves whispering about shares and prices, about companies and profits. The dream of wealth through investing became something that anyone, anywhere, might hope for. In small towns far from New York City, the talk of stocks began quietly. A barber might set down his scissors at the end of the day and tell his neighbor that he had bought a share or two. A school teacher, with a modest salary carefully saved, might speak softly to her friend about her first investment. A farmer, after selling a harvest, might place a few dollars into a company he had read about in the newspaper. The conversation drifted gently across fences, across counters, across dining tables, until investing felt less like a secret and more like a shared ritual. Brokerage offices opened in more and more towns, not only in the great cities but in small communities across the country. They were modest places, a desk or two, a ticker machine clicking steadily in the corner, a clerk carefully writing down orders in neat script. The doorbell would ring softly as a customer entered, tipping his hat or smoothing her dress. The atmosphere was calm, almost hushed, as though the very act of stepping inside was something solemn. The ticker machine sat at the heart of the office. Its steady clicking filled the room with a rhythm that lulled the mind. A strip of paper emerged slowly, carrying numbers and names. Customers leaned close, eyes narrowing as they traced the black ink. Some smiled faintly, others sighed, but always they returned again and again, drawn by the quiet hope of watching their fortunes grow. For many, investing was not about great wealth. It was about belonging. It was about taking part in something larger than themselves. When the teacher bought a share of a company, she felt connected to the nation's progress. When the farmer invested in an automobile firm, he felt that he too was helping build the future. Each purchase was more than a number. It was a piece of a dream. Magazines and newspapers encouraged this gentle tide of investment. They printed stories of clerks who had become wealthy overnight, of shopkeepers whose small investments had multiplied many times. These tales spread quietly through the nation, stirring the imagination. A man might read such a story by lamplight and wonder if he too might one day find his life changed by a few well-chosen shares. A woman might fold the paper and tuck it away, dreaming of the security it might bring her children. The brokers themselves often played the role of guides. They leaned forward across desks, voices calm and reassuring. They explained that the market was safe, that it always rose, that the risks were small. Their words carried the rhythm of confidence, and customers, lulled by this assurance, nodded slowly, believing what they heard, believing what they wished to be true. Some investors were cautious, placing only a few dollars at a time. Others were bolder, borrowing money to buy more than they could afford. The practice of buying on margin grew steadily. A man might place down $10 and borrow 90 more, owning a $100 share with only a fraction of the cost. If the price rose, he gained. If the price fell, he risked everything. But for now, the prices mostly rose. And so the practice spread, quietly, steadily. The habit of investing began to color daily life. In cafes, men unfolded newspapers and compared the market tables printed in fine print. In shops, clerks spoke of their favorite companies between customers. In barber chairs, farmers listened as the latest prices were read aloud from the paper. The stock market had become part of the nation's conversation, a gentle undercurrent that touched even the smallest corners of life. Families began to dream together. A father might say softly that one day they would own a larger home, thanks to the shares he had purchased. A mother might imagine new clothes for her children, bought with profits from the market. Children, overhearing such talk, might picture their futures painted with ease and comfort. These dreams wrapped themselves around the household, filling the evenings with a quiet warmth. The spread of radio only deepened this connection. Broadcasts carried news of companies and markets into living rooms across the nation. The announcer's voice was steady, measured, calm. He spoke of profits and growth, of industries and inventions. Families leaned closer to the radio, listening as though each word carried a promise of prosperity. The static between sentences seemed almost like a pause for reflection, a moment to imagine what might come next. Church groups, clubs, and societies sometimes found themselves speaking of stocks. The conversation might begin with a mention of a neighbor's success, and soon others would join in, offering their own small stories, their own cautious hopes. The talk was never loud, never rushed. It drifted like a gentle breeze through the room, and when it ended, it left behind a lingering sense of optimism. For women especially, investing offered a new form of independence. Some opened accounts in their own names, managing their small savings with care. They read the papers, followed the prices, and made choices quietly, steadily. For them, the act of investing was not only financial, it was personal. It was a step into a world that had once been reserved for men alone, and it gave them a sense of pride and belonging. In rural towns, the ritual of investment took on its own character. A farmer might ride into town on a Saturday, sell his produce at the market, and then stop at the broker's office. He might invest a portion of his earnings before buying supplies and heading home. The journey itself became part of the rhythm of life, a pattern repeated week after week, season after season. Children sometimes watched their parents with wide eyes, sensing the quiet importance of these moments. They might not have understood the numbers or the papers, but they understood the tone of voice, the careful way their father folded the receipt, the gentle way their mother placed the slip of paper in the family Bible for safekeeping. Even in their innocence, they felt that something meaningful was taking place. The optimism of the decade made investing feel safe. The newspapers rarely warned of danger. The brokers rarely spoke of loss. Instead, the mood was one of inevitability. The market would always rise. The profits would always come. The future would always be brighter. People believed these things not because they had proof, but because they wished to believe, and because everyone around them seemed to believe as well. And so, day after day, the habit deepened. more people opened accounts, more offices appeared in towns and cities, more ticker machines clicked softly in the background of daily life. The dream of prosperity spread like a lullaby across the nation. At night, when families settled into bed, the thought of investment sometimes lingered in their minds. A man might close his eyes and picture the ticker tape rising steadily upward. A woman might drift into sleep, imagining the new dress or new furniture that profits would bring. Children, overhearing such talk, might dream of bicycles or books or faraway adventures. Even in slumber, the market was present, woven into the quiet dreams of millions. The rise of everyday investing was not loud. It was not sudden. It was slow, gentle, persistent, like water seeping into the soil. It carried with it a sense of calm inevitability, that this was simply the way life was meant to be. That prosperity was not a gift, but a certainty. But beneath the calm surface, the risks were real. Each borrowed dollar tied the investor more tightly to the fate of the market. Each optimistic purchase placed another weight upon the fragile structure. Yet these dangers were hidden from view, softened by the steady hum of optimism. For now, the story remains quiet. The barber still cuts hair by day and reads his paper by night. The teacher still grades papers and checks her small investments each week. The farmer still tends his fields and places a portion of his earnings into shares. The nation still dreams of prosperity, unaware of what lies ahead. The spread of everyday investing was the lull before the storm, the gentle hum before the silence broke. It wrapped itself around a nation that believed in progress, in wealth, in a future without end. And in that belief, it drifted, softly, steadily, into the deeper night of the decade. The dream of prosperity in the 1920s was built not only on wages, not only on savings, but increasingly on something less solid, something softer, something that seemed harmless at first, but quietly carried great weight. It was credit, and the habit of buying on margin. Credit had already spread into everyday life. Families bought radios, furniture, clothing, and automobiles with installment plans. They signed papers in neat script, promising to pay little by little, week by week, month by month. The goods came home right away, and the payment stretched quietly into the future. It was a gentle system, easy to accept, easy to believe in. For most people, it seemed like freedom. But in the world of investing, credit took on a sharper edge. The practice of margin buying became more and more common. A man who wished to buy $100 of stock did not need $100. He needed only 10, or perhaps 20. The rest was borrowed, promised to the broker, carried like a shadow behind the investment. At first, it seemed like a miracle. A small sum opened the door to a larger world. A teacher with $50 could suddenly hold 500 in shares. A farmer with $100 could suddenly control 1,000. The leverage was intoxicating. The profits multiplied quickly when prices rose. Each tick upward on the ticker tape meant not only gain, but magnified gain. And in those years, the market mostly rose, steadily, confidently. The newspapers spoke of new records each month. The numbers climbed higher and higher, and with each rise, the temptation grew stronger. Why place down all your money when you could borrow, and own more, and earn more? Brokerage offices encouraged it. They explained margin accounts with calm voices and steady smiles. They reassured customers that the risks were small, that losses were rare, that the market always came back. A man signed his name at the bottom of a form, and in that moment, he stepped into a deeper bond with Wall Street. The rhythm of margin buying became part of daily life. A clerk placed a small amount down and borrowed the rest. A seamstress invested her modest savings with borrowed dollars beside them. A grocer who once counted pennies carefully now borrowed sums far larger than he ever imagined holding, and all believed that tomorrow's profits would cover today's debts. The ticker tape machine clicked on in the corner. Numbers rolled across the thin ribbon of paper. Investors watched with steady eyes. The shares they held represented not only their money, but borrowed money too. Each rise brought relief. Each fall brought a faint tightening in the chest. But for now, the rises outweighed the falls. And so the practice spread quietly, almost invisibly, through the land. Banks lent freely. Credit flowed easily. The atmosphere was one of generosity and trust. Collateral seemed less important when profits were always expected. Loan officers approved papers with calm efficiency. Customers signed with eager hands. The entire system expanded like a balloon filling with air, silent, weightless, seemingly safe. At home, families spoke of margin as if it were natural. A father might explain to his son that their shares were growing faster because of a margin account. A mother might mention that the profits would soon pay for a new stove. Children listened without fully understanding, yet sensing the quiet importance in their parents' voices. The word margin entered daily vocabulary, wrapped in optimism and hope. For many, it did not feel like debt. It felt like opportunity. The debt was invisible, hidden behind the shares themselves. As long as prices rose, the debt seemed harmless, even useful. People told themselves that borrowing to invest was not truly borrowing. It was simply accelerating what was already certain. The newspapers rarely spoke of the risks. Instead, they carried charts of rising prices, glowing descriptions of successful investors, cheerful editorials about endless growth. Readers sipped their coffee and nodded, confident that their own small investments, magnified by margin, would carry them toward the same fortune. At night, the thought of margin buying lingered in the minds of many. A man might lie in bed and imagine his borrowed shares climbing upward, turning his modest sum into something much larger. A woman might picture the profits paying off, not only the margin debt, but also bringing new comfort to her home. The dreams were soft, steady, reassuring. Yet beneath the calm, the risks multiplied, for margin was a double-edged practice. It magnified profits when prices rose, but it magnified losses when prices fell. A small decline could erase an entire account. A sharper fall could wipe out savings completely. Brokers held the right to call for more money when values dropped, to demand payment at the worst possible moment. But these details were often overlooked or quietly pushed aside. For now, the mood remained bright. A barber invested on margin and smiled as he cut hair, imagining his profits. A seamstress whispered to her sister about the dress she would soon buy with her gains. A teacher spoke gently to her students about progress, while privately believing her own shares were proof of it. A farmer walked the edge of his field, thinking of his crop not only in bushels but in stalks, each one tied to the invisible cord of margin. The quiet spread of this habit changed the nation's relationship with the market. It was no longer only about savings. It was about promises, about debts hidden beneath optimism. The system was woven together with threads of borrowed dollars, delicate, fragile, easily broken. Yet in the calm rhythm of the 1920s, it felt unshakable. The brokers watched the growth with satisfaction. Their commissions grew with each trade. Their offices filled with more customers. Their tickers clicked steadily from dawn to dusk. The sound was hypnotic, comforting, like a lullaby of numbers. The brokers leaned back in their chairs, confident that the system was stable, confident that the profits would never cease. And so, the practice deepened, spreading through every layer of society. The wealthy bought on margin, the middle class bought on margin. Even the modest saver found a way to borrow a little more. The entire market rested on promises, promises to pay tomorrow what could not be paid today, promises that depended on prices rising forever. Still, the evenings remained calm. Radios hummed softly in parlors. Families gathered around tables to eat simple meals. Automobiles rolled slowly down quiet streets. Street lamps glowed like beacons in the night. Life went on peacefully, gently, with no hint of the storm that lay hidden beneath the surface. Credit and margin buying were like shadows in a dream. They followed each step, unseen but present. They darkened the corners of prosperity even as the nation slept soundly within it. For now, the shadows remained quiet, drifting along with the music of jazz, the hum of radios, the steady clicking of ticker tapes. But the shadows were growing, softly, steadily, waiting for the day when the light would shift. And so, the nation continued, buying more, borrowing more, investing more, wrapped in the belief that prosperity was endless, unaware that each borrowed dollar tied the dream more tightly to the fate of the market, unaware that the lullaby of credit carried within it a note of warning, faint, distant, almost unheard. The practice of margin buying was the heartbeat beneath the calm, steady, constant, unseen by most. It carried the rhythm of optimism, the rhythm of trust, the rhythm of a nation drifting deeper into the dream of endless prosperity. Through the middle years of the 1920s, the mood across America was one of confidence, optimism, even joy. Radios glowed in parlors. Automobiles rattled along dirt roads. Children played beneath lampposts in the evenings. And in the background, always in the background, the ticker machines clicked and clicked, reminding everyone that prosperity was still climbing upward. But beneath the cheerful rhythm, faint signs of unease began to appear, small, subtle, easy to overlook. They were whispers carried in newspapers, murmurs spoken in quiet offices, figures that did not quite match the glowing headlines. The nation, wrapped in its dream of endless wealth, barely noticed. But the signs were there. Factories across the country had produced more goods than people could buy. Warehouses filled slowly with unsold radios, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners. Automobiles rolled off assembly lines faster than families could purchase them. Store windows gleamed with abundance, yet behind the glass, clerks noticed fewer customers carrying goods to the counter. The shelves looked full, perhaps too full. On farms, too, the pattern was clear. Wheat fields stretched wide beneath the summer sun. Corn rose tall in neat rows. Harvests were plentiful, but markets were weak. Prices for grain and crops fell year after year. Farmers hauled wagon loads to town, only to find the buyers unwilling to pay enough to cover the cost of seed, equipment, and debt. Barns filled with surplus grain, while banknotes waited quietly to be paid. Some farmers abandoned their land, unable to meet their obligations. Others borrowed more, hoping that next year would be better. Tractors sat silent in fields where fuel could not be afforded. Families tightened their belts, serving simpler meals, mending clothes again and again. Yet in the cities, the mood of prosperity often drowned out these rural troubles. The farm crisis was spoken of, but not always heard. Banks too began to feel quiet strain, for they had lent generously, not only to farmers but to investors, to businesses, to ordinary families buying on installment plans. Each loan was a thread, delicate and fine, and together they wove a fabric that looked strong but pulled tighter with each passing year. If one thread broke, others might follow. But in the glow of the decade, the fragility went unnoticed. Some economists, professors, and cautious bankers began to voice their concerns. They wrote essays in journals, warning that prices could not rise forever. They gave lectures in quiet halls, explaining that debt was mounting faster than wealth. They spoke of danger, gently but firmly. Yet their words rarely reached the wider public. And when they did, they were met with shrugs. The mood of the nation was too buoyant, too cheerful, too certain of prosperity. In broker offices, a few whispered to their clients about caution, suggesting that not all companies were sound, reminding them that shares could fall as easily as they could rise. But most customers shook their heads and smiled, believing what they wished to believe, that the future could only bring more gain. The newspapers, eager to please their readers, often ignored the warning voices. Instead, they filled their pages with charts showing upward lines, articles praising new inventions, new profits, new opportunities. Editors knew that optimism sold papers, and so the quiet doubts were pushed aside. Still, the signs remained. A factory laying off workers after producing too much. A bank closing quietly in a small town. A farm auction where neighbors gathered to bid on the possessions of a family who could no longer pay their debts. These scenes unfolded softly, in corners of the nation, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, persistent, like faint cracks spreading in stone. In New York, too, the signs were visible to those who looked closely. The market rose higher, but some prices seemed detached from reality. Companies with little profit saw their shares climb just as fast as the strongest firms. Rumors spread quickly. Speculation grew wilder. A man might buy shares not because he believed in the company, but because he believed someone else would pay more tomorrow. It was a game of passing the paper, with each hand hoping not to be the last. Margin accounts deepened the risk. More and more borrowed money filled the market. Each upward tick brought profit, but each downward tick carried the threat of ruin. Brokers quietly grew nervous, even as they smiled at their customers, for they knew how fragile the balance truly was. And still, life outside the offices seemed calm. Radios played cheerful music in the evenings. Families gathered for picnics on warm Sundays. Couples strolled beneath the glow of street lamps, laughing softly. The nation appeared steady, confident, at peace. Only beneath the surface did unease slowly ripple outward. A few prominent voices tried to raise alarm. Roger Babson, a financial analyst, spoke openly in 1929 that sooner or later a crash is coming and it may be terrible. His words were printed in the papers, and for a day, perhaps two, they stirred conversation. But soon they were dismissed. The market dipped briefly after his warning, then rose again, and the public laughed quietly at the idea that the boom could ever end. Others pointed to the imbalance between rich and poor. The wealthiest grew wealthier, investing in great amounts, while many workers earned only modest wages, barely enough to keep pace with rising costs of living. The gap widened silently, like a river carving deeper into the land. Yet this, too, was rarely discussed openly. Optimism was easier to hold than discomfort. In homes across the country, the small signs of trouble were easily overlooked. A missed payment on an installment plan was excused as temporary. A falling crop price was explained as seasonal. A closed bank was spoken of as an isolated case. People told themselves these stories, believing them, because belief was easier than doubt. And so, the decade continued, with two truths woven together. On the surface, prosperity, laughter, jazz music, new cars, radios glowing softly in the night. Beneath, debt, imbalance, strain, and the faint crack spreading slowly wider. For the sleepy listener, the story does not break into alarm. It drifts softly, like the rhythm of waves against a shore. One small sign here, another there, each a gentle reminder that beneath every dream, shadows may linger, that beneath every song, silence waits. The nation drifted on, unaware of how close the balance stood to breaking. The barbershop still buzzed with talk of stocks. The classroom still echoed with lessons of progress. The farm still waited for rain and fair prices. The office still clicked with the steady rhythm of the ticker machine. Life continued, as though the dream could never fade. But the signs of trouble were real. They gathered quietly, like clouds far on the horizon, unnoticed by most, but slowly growing, slowly darkening. Their presence was faint but certain, a part of the deeper rhythm of history. And so, the decade, still filled with music and light, carried within it the soft whispers of warning, whispers that few listened to, whispers that would soon rise into something louder, something that could not be ignored. By the autumn of 1929, the nation was still wrapped in its dream of prosperity. The stock market had risen through the summer, climbing to heights never before imagined. Newspapers printed bold headlines of new records, and in broker offices, the ticker machines clicked with a rhythm that seemed endless, steady, hypnotic, like the heartbeat of the decade itself. But in the quiet corners of the financial world, unease began to stir. It was not yet panic, not even fear, only a faint tension, like a thread pulled just slightly too tight. A few cautious voices spoke softly of danger, warning that the market had risen too far, too fast. But the words were often drowned out by the louder music of optimism. On Wall Street, the air was filled with a strange mixture of cheer and strain. The brokers still smiled. The investors still leaned forward eagerly to read the tape. But behind their eyes, there was something else. a flicker of worry, a whisper of doubt. They had watched the numbers rise and rise, but they knew that even the strongest tree can sway too far in the wind before it breaks. In the first weeks of October, the market dipped, just slightly, enough to unsettle some. Stocks that had only climbed for months now slipped a little downward. The ticker tape recorded the changes with the same steady rhythm. Click, click, click. But for the first time, the numbers were not always higher, not always brighter. Some investors shifted uneasily in their chairs. Others told themselves it was nothing, only a pause, only a breath before the next climb. Crowds outside the stock exchange grew larger in those weeks. Men gathered on the steps, staring up at the tall stone facade, whispering among themselves. Messengers hurried in and out, carrying envelopes. Policemen kept a steady watch, their faces calm, their eyes alert. The street itself felt different, less certain, less sure. Inside broker offices, the atmosphere shifted too. The once light-hearted conversations grew quieter. Customers leaned closer to clerks, asking softly about their accounts. Some requested updates more often than before, their voices betraying a trace of worry. The ticker machine still clicked, but the sound no longer felt like music to all who listened. To some, it had become a drumbeat of unease. Newspapers began to mention the dips in their financial pages, though the front pages still carried cheerful news of sports, entertainment, and politics. The warnings were tucked into columns of numbers, read mostly by the curious and the cautious. Still, the words were there. Small hints that the market's endless rise might not be endless after all. Across the nation, in small towns and quiet farms, the news spread slowly. A barber in a chair mentioned that prices had slipped. A teacher in the staff room whispered that her shares were worth a little less. A farmer at the feed store shook his head and muttered that the market was not as strong as it once seemed. The words drifted like autumn leaves, scattered here and there, carried by the wind, but not yet gathering into a storm. October days passed with a curious rhythm. Prices dipped, then rose again, then dipped once more. Each movement was followed closely, almost breath by breath. The nation waited, uncertain, hopeful, trying to believe that prosperity still held steady. In the evenings, when the offices closed and the tickers fell silent, the city carried the same outward calm. Lights glowed in apartment windows. Radios played soft music. Couples strolled beneath the lamps. Children played games in the fading light. The surface of life remained steady, but underneath, tension hummed quietly, like a low note in a song. The brokers whispered to one another in private. Some admitted that too much borrowed money had flooded the market. Others confessed that prices of certain companies were far beyond their true worth. They worried about what might happen if the decline grew steeper, if the margin calls began. But when they faced their customers, they spoke calmly, reassuringly, telling them that all was well, that the market always recovered. On October 23rd, the market fell sharply. The decline was swift enough to startle even the confident. The ticker machines struggled to keep up, running minutes behind the actual trades. The strips of paper poured out, carrying numbers that slid downward instead of upward. In offices, the sound of the machines was no longer a comfort. It was a steady reminder that something was shifting. The next day, October 24th, the day that would be remembered as Black Thursday, the crowds outside the exchange grew larger than ever before. Hundreds gathered on Wall Street, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the tall building in silence, waiting for news to spill out from its stone walls. Inside, the exchange roared with voices, though to the sleepy listener, it is best imagined as a muffled hum, steady and repetitive, like the distant roll of thunder. Prices tumbled that day. Shares that had seemed strong only weeks before fell sharply. Margin calls went out quietly, then louder, then more urgently. Some investors found their accounts wiped away in a matter of hours. Others scrambled to sell, only to find few buyers willing to take their shares. The ticker tape fell further behind, its clicking now a frantic rhythm, but still steady, still constant. Yet, even then, the panic was not complete. Bankers met quietly in back rooms, promising to support the market. Wealthy men stepped forward to purchase shares, calming some of the fear. By the end of the day, the market had steadied somewhat. Not recovered, but steadied, and many told themselves that the worst had passed. Outside, as night fell over New York, the crowd slowly dispersed. Men walked home in silence, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Policemen remained at their posts, watching the quiet street. Lamps flickered, radios played, couples strolled. The city returned to its outward calm, even as unease lingered in the hearts of many. The days that followed were tense. Each morning, investors waited anxiously for the exchange to open. Each hour, they checked the ticker tape, listening to its clicking with both hope and dread. Each evening, they read the papers with furrowed brows, searching for reassurance that all was well. The rhythm of life continued, but the notes had changed. In small towns, the whispers grew louder. A grocer told his neighbor that he had lost more than he could afford. A teacher admitted that her savings were nearly gone. A farmer, already struggling with low crop prices, confessed that his investments had vanished like smoke. The dream of easy wealth was fading, slowly, steadily. By the final week of October, the storm was near. The signs of trouble had become clearer, though still many tried to ignore them. They told themselves that recovery was certain, that the market would rise again as it always had. But the balance had shifted. The cracks had widened. The calm surface was breaking. And so, as the last days of October drifted forward, the nation found itself standing on the edge of a moment it did not yet understand. The ticker machines still clicked. The crowd still gathered. The brokers still smiled. But beneath it all, the air was heavy, the tension undeniable. The crash was approaching, softly, steadily, inevitably, like the slow roll of thunder before a storm. The morning of October 24th, 1929, began like so many others. The autumn air in New York carried a faint chill. The sky above Wall Street was pale and still, and yet, even before the exchange opened its doors, people gathered on the narrow street. Their footsteps echoed softly on the stone pavement, their voices low, uncertain, as though they already sensed that something was different. Inside, clerks and brokers prepared as usual. Papers were stacked neatly on desks, telephones arranged carefully, ticker machines ready with fresh rolls of paper. The great hall of the stock exchange stood waiting, its marble floors polished, its tall columns watching silently. At 9:30, the opening bell rang, a clear sound that usually carried with it a note of confidence. But on this day, it marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. Almost at once, the orders flooded in. Sell, sell, sell. The ticker machines began to click, faster than before, printing endless strips of numbers that told a different story than the weeks before. Prices tumbled downward, step by step, line by line. Shares that had once risen with such ease now fell heavily, as though pulled by invisible hands. The clerks leaned over the machines, their eyes widening as they read the numbers. The brokers raised their voices, calling out trades, waving their hands in sharp motions. But the sleepy listener need not imagine chaos. Instead, picture a steady hum, a low murmur that filled the hall like the sound of distant thunder rolling across the horizon. Outside the exchange, the crowd grew larger. Men pressed close to the building's steps, straining to hear any scrap of news. Some held newspapers folded tightly in their hands. Some leaned against lampposts, eyes fixed on the great stone facade. Policemen stood at attention, guiding the flow of the crowd, their faces calm, though their eyes betrayed curiosity. The news spread quickly along Wall Street. Messengers hurried with envelopes. Telephones rang without pause. Banks received urgent calls from their clients. Newspapers prepared extra editions. The market was falling, and no one could be sure where it would stop. By mid-morning, the decline was sharp. Shares of great companies, U.S. Steel, General Electric, Radio Corporation of America, fell in steady drops. Each click of the ticker machine seemed heavier than the one before. A slip of paper carried the news across the room. Another slip carried it further, until all who read it felt the same quiet weight settle upon them. Margin calls began to go out. Brokers telephoned their customers, their voices steady but firm. More money was needed to cover the losses. Customers listened in silence, holding the receiver tightly, the hum of the line filling their ears. Some promised to send more. Some whispered that they had none left. Each call was a thread fraying quietly. In the streets beyond Wall Street, the rumors spread. A man stepped into a cafe and told the waiter that the market was collapsing. A woman carried the news home to her family, her voice hushed, her eyes uncertain. By noon, the whispers had traveled across the city, across the nation. The dream of endless prosperity was trembling. Yet, even as the market fell, there was still hope, still the belief that it might recover, that the decline was only temporary. Bankers met quietly in private rooms, their cigars glowing faintly in the dim light. They promised to support the market, to purchase shares, to restore confidence. Their words carried outward like ripples in water, calming some, steadying others. Indeed, by afternoon, the market steadied. The prices still low, but no longer plunging so quickly. The ticker machines clicked at a slower pace. Investors breathed a little easier. The whispers softened. if only for a moment. Some believed the worst had passed. Some even smiled, telling themselves that tomorrow would be brighter again. But the memory of that morning lingered. It settled deep into the hearts of those who had watched their fortunes shrink in hours. It lingered in the eyes of the brokers who had seen the panic firsthand. It remained in the murmurs of the crowd that still stood outside the exchange long after the bell had closed the day. That evening, as darkness fell across New York, the city carried an unusual silence. Lamps glowed in apartment windows. Radios played softly. Couples still strolled beneath the street lamps. But beneath the calm surface, unease drifted like a shadow. Men carried home newspapers with heavy headlines. Women stirred soup in their kitchens, lost in quiet thought. Children sensed the change in the air, though they did not understand it. In small towns across the country, the news arrived by late editions of the paper. Farmers read the headlines by lantern light. Shopkeepers studied the words with furrowed brows. Clerks whispered to one another as they locked up their offices. The crash had begun, though most still believed it was only a stumble, only a passing storm. Black Thursday, as it would come to be known, was not the end. It was only the beginning. The day had shaken confidence. It had shown how fragile the dream truly was. Yet the nation still clung to hope, still told itself that tomorrow the market would rise again. The belief in endless prosperity was not easily abandoned. And so, the night of October 24th passed quietly. Radios hummed with soft music. Automobiles rolled slowly along city streets. Families said their prayers and drifted into sleep, unaware that the days ahead would bring even deeper shadows. Black Thursday lingered as a memory, soft but heavy, like the echo of thunder after a storm has passed. The crowd outside the exchange would remember the weight of the silence, the way the buildings seemed to loom above them, unchanging while fortunes shifted inside. The brokers would remember the steady clicking of the ticker tape, carrying numbers that seemed to fall without end. The investors would remember the phone calls, the margin calls, the sense of slipping helplessly into something larger than themselves. For the sleepy listener, the day unfolds not as panic, but as a slow unraveling, the sound of paper spooling endlessly from machines, the murmur of voices rising and falling like waves, the steady footsteps of crowds outside on the pavement, the distant hum of a city that continued its rhythm, even as one of its great illusions began to fade. Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, a day that marked the first great crack in the dream of prosperity, a day that would be remembered not for its noise, but for its silence. The silence that came when people realized, softly, slowly, that the future was not as certain as they had believed. The morning of October 24th, 1929, began like so many others. The autumn air in New York carried a faint chill. The sky above Wall Street was pale and still. And yet, even before the exchange opened its doors, people gathered on the narrow street. Their footsteps echoed softly on the stone pavement, their voices low, uncertain, as though they already sensed that something was different. Inside, clerks and brokers prepared as usual. Papers were stacked neatly on desks, telephones arranged carefully, ticker machines ready with fresh rolls of paper. The great hall of the stock exchange stood waiting, its marble floors polished, its tall columns watching silently. At 9:30, the opening bell rang, a clear sound that usually carried with it a note of confidence. But on this day, it marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. Almost at once, the orders flooded in. Sell, sell, sell. The ticker machines began to click, faster than before, printing endless strips of numbers that told a different story than the weeks before. Prices tumbled downward, step by step, line by line. Shares that had once risen with such ease now fell heavily, as though pulled by invisible hands. The clerks leaned over the machines, their eyes widening as they read the numbers. The brokers raised their voices, calling out trades, waving their hands in sharp motions. But the sleepy listener need not imagine chaos. Instead, picture a steady hum, a low murmur that filled the hall like the sound of distant thunder rolling across the horizon. Outside the exchange, the crowd grew larger. Men pressed close to the building steps, straining to hear any scrap of news. Some held newspapers folded tightly in their hands. Some leaned against lampposts, eyes fixed on the great stone facade. Policemen stood at attention, guiding the flow of the crowd, their faces calm, though their eyes betrayed curiosity. The news spread quickly along Wall Street. Messengers hurried with envelopes. Telephones rang without pause. Banks received urgent calls from their clients. Newspapers prepared extra editions. The market was falling, and no one could be sure where it would stop. By mid-morning, the decline was sharp. Shares of great companies, U.S. Steel, General Electric, Radio Corporation of America, fell in steady drops. Each click of the ticker machine seemed heavier than the one before. A slip of paper carried the news across the room. Another slip carried it further, until all who read it felt the same quiet weight settle upon them. Margin calls began to go out. Brokers telephoned their customers, their voices steady but firm. More money was needed to cover the losses. Customers listened in silence, holding the receiver tightly, the hum of the line filling their ears. Some promised to send more. Some whispered that they had none left. Each call was a thread fraying quietly. In the streets beyond Wall Street, the rumors spread. A man stepped into a cafe and told the waiter that the market was collapsing. A woman carried the news home to her family, her voice hushed, her eyes uncertain. By noon, the whispers had traveled across the city, across the nation. The dream of endless prosperity was trembling. Yet even as the market fell, there was still hope, still the belief that it might recover, that the decline was only temporary. Bankers met quietly in private rooms, their cigars glowing faintly in the dim light. They promised to support the market, to purchase shares, to restore confidence. Their words carried outward like ripples in water, calming some, steadying others. Indeed, by afternoon, the market steadied. The prices still low, but no longer plunging so quickly. The ticker machines clicked at a slower pace. Investors breathed a little easier. The whispers softened, if only for a moment. Some believed the worst had passed. Some even smiled, telling themselves that tomorrow would be brighter again. But the memory of that morning lingered. It settled deep into the hearts of those who had watched their fortunes shrink in hours. It lingered in the eyes of the brokers who had seen the panic firsthand. It remained in the murmurs of the crowd that still stood outside the exchange long after the bell had closed the day. That evening, as darkness fell across New York, the city carried an unusual silence. Lamps glowed in apartment windows. Radios played softly. Couples still strolled beneath the street lamps. But beneath the calm surface, unease drifted like a shadow. Men carried home newspapers with heavy headlines. Women stirred soup in their kitchens, lost in quiet thought. Children sensed the change in the air, though they did not understand it. In small towns across the country, the news arrived by late editions of the paper. Farmers read the headlines by lantern light. Shopkeepers studied the words with furrowed brows. Clerks whispered to one another as they locked up their offices. The crash had begun, though most still believed it was only a stumble, only a passing storm. Black Thursday, as it would come to be known, was not the end. It was only the beginning. The day had shaken confidence. It had shown how fragile the dream truly was. Yet the nation still clung to hope, still told itself that tomorrow the market would rise again. The belief in endless prosperity was not easily abandoned. And so, the night of October 24th passed quietly. Radios hummed with soft music. Automobiles rolled slowly along city streets. Families said their prayers and drifted into sleep, unaware that the days ahead would bring even deeper shadows. Black Thursday lingered as a memory, soft but heavy, like the echo of thunder after a storm has passed. The crowd outside the exchange would remember the weight of the silence, the way the building seemed to loom above them, unchanging, while fortunes shifted inside. The brokers would remember the steady clicking of the ticker tape, carrying numbers that seemed to fall without end. The investors would remember the phone calls, the margin calls, the sense of slipping helplessly into something larger than themselves. For the sleepy listener, the day unfolds not as panic, but as a slow unraveling, the sound of paper spooling endlessly from machines, the murmur of voices rising and falling like waves, the steady footsteps of crowds outside on the pavement, the distant hum of a city that continued its rhythm, even as one of its great illusions began to fade. Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. A day that marked the first great crack in the dream of prosperity. A day that would be remembered not for its noise, but for its silence. The silence that came when people realized, softly, slowly, that the future was not as certain as they had believed. The morning of October 29th, 1929, began beneath a gray sky. The air over New York carried a heavy stillness. As dawn crept between the tall buildings, people were already on the move, footsteps echoing softly against stone. The narrow street in front of the stock exchange filled before the bell ever rang. Men and women stood in clusters, their voices low, their eyes fixed upon the great stone facade. Inside, clerks prepared for the day as they always had. Papers stacked neatly, telephones resting in their cradles, ticker machines ready with fresh rolls of thin white ribbon. Yet even before the opening bell, there was a weight in the air, a tension that could be felt but not named. It was as though everyone present sensed that something irreversible was about to unfold. At 9:30, the bell rang, its tone sharp, clear. It echoed off the marble walls and drifted outward into the waiting crowd. And almost instantly, the exchange was flooded with orders. Not the steady rhythm of ordinary days, not the hum of routine, but a wave, a surge, a torrent of selling. Sell, sell, sell. The word repeated itself again and again, whispered into telephones, shouted across the floor, scribbled onto slips of paper. The ticker machines sprang to life, clicking faster and faster, their thin ribbons of paper spooling onto the floor. The numbers they carried tumbled downward, line after line. To the sleepy listener, imagine not noise, but a steady, heavy drumbeat. The clicks of the machine forming a relentless rhythm, faster than the human mind could follow. Each tick a reminder that prices were slipping lower, lower still. By mid-morning, the exchange was drowning in orders. Clerks rushed from desk to desk, their faces pale. Brokers waved their arms, their voices straining. Yet the true sound of the day was not shouting. It was the endless clicking of the machines, the thin strips of paper pouring out onto the floor, carrying news that grew darker with each passing moment. Crowds outside swelled until the narrow street was full. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, staring upward at the exchange. Policemen tried to keep order, their batons resting quietly at their sides. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pencils scratching across notebooks. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by murmurs, whispers of ruin, fragments of half-heard sentences. Margin calls went out in a flood. Telephones rang without pause. Brokers' voices were calm but firm as they told their clients that more money was needed. Some customers promised to send it, though their voices trembled. Others admitted softly that they had none left. Accounts were wiped out in minutes. Fortunes that had taken years to build vanished before the noon hour. In the great hall of the exchange, the ticker machines could not keep pace. They lagged behind by minutes, then by nearly an hour. Investors waited anxiously for the paper to spool out, desperate to know the value of their holdings. The delay itself became part of the fear. For when the numbers finally arrived, they were always worse than expected. Shares that had been symbols of prosperity only weeks before now fell like stones. General Electric, Westinghouse, U.S. Steel, Radio Corporation of America. Names that had once shone with promise were now written in black ink beside prices that dropped lower and lower. Each number was a shadow falling across the dream of endless growth. The panic spread outward from the exchange into the city. A man stepped into a cafe and whispered that the market was collapsing. A woman carried the news home on the subway, her hands trembling as she held the evening paper. Banks received desperate calls, lines of customers forming quietly at their doors. Some sought to withdraw what savings they could. Others begged for loans to cover their losses. The air itself seemed filled with unease. Yet outside, life continued its rhythm. Automobiles rolled along the streets. Children hurried to school, their voices carrying laughter that seemed strangely out of place. Radios hummed softly in apartments, playing gentle tunes as though nothing had changed. The city carried on, but beneath it all, a shadow lengthened. By afternoon, the decline deepened further. The exchange floor was a sea of movement, papers scattering, telephones ringing endlessly. But again, for the listener drifting toward sleep, the scene is not frantic but heavy, a constant repetition of sound, the clicks of machines, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of footsteps across polished marble, a rhythm both hypnotic and ominous. The ticker tapes piled in corners, unread by many who no longer wished to see the numbers. Brokers leaned back in exhaustion, their collars loosened, their eyes fixed on nothing. Clerks moved slowly, carrying slips of paper that seemed weightless, yet carried ruin within them. The atmosphere was one of slow collapse, not sudden destruction, like a building crumbling brick by brick rather than all at once. Outside, the crowd remained, standing long into the evening, waiting for news that did not bring comfort. The exchange bell finally rang to close the day, but the silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. Men walked away with bowed heads. Some folded newspapers tightly under their arms. Others carried nothing at all. Their footsteps echoed softly on the pavement as the shadows lengthened across Wall Street. Black Tuesday had destroyed the illusion of endless growth. In a single day, billions of dollars in paper wealth had vanished. Fortunes were lost. Savings were erased. The dream of prosperity had been broken. And yet, even then, many still clung to hope, telling themselves that tomorrow might bring recovery, that the market would rise again, as it always had before. That night, the city seemed unusually quiet. Lamps glowed faintly in apartment windows. Radios played music that drifted through the dark. Couples still strolled beneath the lamps, though their voices were hushed. Families gathered at tables, but the conversation was muted, filled with pauses. The crash was not yet fully understood, not yet fully felt, but its shadow had already settled across the land. In small towns across America, the news arrived by telegraph, by radio, by newspaper. Farmers read the headlines by lantern light, their hands rough and tired from the day's work. Shopkeepers studied the columns of numbers in disbelief. Teachers folded the papers silently, unwilling to think of what their savings had become. The words Wall Street crash spread like a whisper from one household to the next. Children sensed the unease in their parents' voices. They saw the furrowed brows, the long silences, the way their mothers stirred soup more slowly, their fathers staring longer at the radio dial. They did not understand the numbers, the shares, the losses, but they felt the change in the air. Black Tuesday lingered not only as a day but as a feeling, the weight of uncertainty, the slow crumbling of confidence, the quiet realization that the dream had ended. It was not noise that defined it, but silence. The silence of men walking home with empty hands. The silence of families gathering in uneasy stillness. The silence of a nation beginning to wake from its dream of endless prosperity. And so, the day passed into night. The lamps flickered, the radios hummed, the city breathed in its sleep. But beneath the calm, The truth was clear. The market had fallen. The dream had broken. The future would be different now. Black Tuesday. October 29th, 1929. Remembered not for its sound, but for its silence. The silence of a nation standing at the edge of change, drifting slowly, helplessly, into the deeper night of the depression to come. When the last days of October faded into November 1929, the market had already changed the nation. The crash had swept across Wall Street like a tide pulling back to sea, leaving behind silence, uncertainty, and faces turned quietly toward the unknown. At first, many told themselves it was only temporary, that the market would recover, as it always had before. But the days stretched on, the numbers did not rise, and the reality of loss began to settle like dust upon the homes and streets of America. Families who had once spoken proudly of their investments grew quiet. Newspapers that had once printed glowing headlines of record highs now carried stories of bankruptcies, layoffs, and closures. In towns both large and small, the cheerful hum of prosperity slowed into something softer, something heavier. Men who had walked confidently into broker offices now avoided those doors, their pockets empty, their accounts erased, their shoes tapped against the same sidewalks, but their steps no longer carried the same rhythm. They walked slower, heads lower, unsure of what lay ahead. In New York, the crowd still gathered near Wall Street, but their voices were hushed. Some stood with folded arms, staring silently at the stock exchange. Others leaned against lampposts, their hats pulled low over their brows. The great stone building looked unchanged, yet everyone who looked upon it felt that something inside had shifted forever. Across the nation, the effects spread outward like ripples in a pond. Factories slowed their machines. Orders declined. Employers who once promised steady work now handed out pink slips instead. Men carried their lunch pails home untouched, telling their families that there was no work today, and perhaps not tomorrow either. In kitchens, mothers stretched meals farther than before. A pot of stew thinned with water, a loaf of bread cut into thinner slices, coffee grounds reused for one more pot. The meals were simple, quiet, sustaining, but they carried with them the weight of worry. Soup kitchens began to appear in cities. Churches and charities opened their doors. Men lined up along sidewalks, collars turned up against the wind, their hands in their pockets, their breath rising in the cold morning air. They shuffled forward slowly, waiting for a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, perhaps a cup of coffee. The line moved quietly, the sound of footsteps soft against the pavement. Children watched their parents with wide eyes, sensing the change though not fully understanding it. They saw the long silences at the dinner table, the way their mothers mended clothes again and again, the way their fathers sat longer by the radio, staring at the dial without turning the knob. The air of homes grew heavier, but families held together, bound by quiet endurance. Banks began to close in some towns, quietly at first, then more frequently. Customers who had trusted their savings to those buildings arrived to find the doors locked, the windows dark. Signs posted in neat handwriting explained that the bank was closed until further notice. People pressed their faces to the glass, looking inside at desks and chairs left empty. The silence outside was heavy, broken only by whispered questions. What will happen now? What will we do? Farmers, already strained by low crop prices, felt the weight more heavily still. Wheat lay unsold in bins, corn piled high with no buyers, loans pressed down like stones upon their backs. Auctions were held in quiet fields, neighbors gathering to watch as furniture, tools, livestock, and even the land itself was sold to cover debts. The sound of the auctioneer's voice carried across the air, rhythmic, steady, but the faces of those listening were solemn, weary, resigned. In towns, shopkeepers noticed fewer customers crossing their thresholds. Shelves still carried goods, but coins were scarce. A child might press his nose against the glass, staring at toys or sweets he could no longer afford. A mother might step inside only to ask the price, then nod politely before walking out again. The cash drawers opened less often, the sound of coins ringing softer and softer each day. Through it all, radios continued to hum in homes. The voices of announcers spoke of news from Washington, of speeches by leaders, of reports from Wall Street. Families leaned closer to listen, searching for reassurance, for some word that the hardship would end. The static between sentences seemed louder now, filling the spaces where hope had once been certain. In the evenings, men walked longer distances in search of work. They carried folded papers in their pockets, listing factories, shops, offices where they had already asked and been turned away. Their shoes grew worn from the miles walked. Their coats grew thin against the chill. Yet still they walked, hoping that tomorrow someone might need them, that tomorrow might bring a chance. In cities, whole families sometimes lost their homes. Tents and shacks appeared in empty lots, built from scraps of wood, metal, and cloth. Fires burned in barrels, smoke curling into the night. Men sat around the flames, their faces lined with weariness. Women tucked children into makeshift beds, whispering soft words of comfort. The wind carried the sound of coughing, of footsteps, of silence broken by the crackle of fire. And yet, amid the hardship, life carried on. Children still played in the streets, chasing one another with laughter. Neighbors still greeted one another kindly, sharing what little they had. Churches rang their bells on Sunday mornings, and congregations gathered in prayer. The rhythm of life did not end. It only slowed, softened, grew heavier. For the sleepy listener, these scenes unfold not in drama, but in calm repetition. The steady shuffle of men in bread lines, the quiet stirring of pots in kitchens, the slow creak of wagons carrying families' belongings down country roads, the gentle hum of radios in darkened rooms, all part of a lullaby of survival. The newspapers carried photographs of the times, black and white images of men standing in long rows, waiting for food, families huddled together in makeshift shelters, farmers watching over empty fields. The pictures told stories that words sometimes could not, and yet, even then, many held on to hope, believing that the hardship was only temporary, that brighter days would return. Each night, as lamps dimmed and radios fell silent, families lay down in their beds with thoughts heavy in their minds. Some prayed softly, some whispered to their children that tomorrow would be better. Some simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside, waiting for sleep to come. The silence of those nights carried as much weight as the noise of the days. After the fall of the market, the nation entered a new rhythm, slower, quieter, filled with uncertainty, but also with endurance. People adjusted their lives in small ways, saving more carefully, working harder for less, holding on to one another with greater tenderness. The decade of abundance had ended, but life itself continued, steady, persistent, moving forward one day at a time. And so, after the crash, America found itself not in ruin, but in transition. The dream of endless prosperity had broken, yet the spirit of survival remained. The songs of jazz still drifted through radios. The laughter of children still echoed down streets. The bells of churches still rang each Sunday morning. In these small rhythms, the nation carried on, slowly, softly, through the first quiet years of the Great Depression.